Well, good evening, everybody, and greetings from a dark and rainy London. My name is Tom Nixon, and I'm a senior lecturer in medieval art and architecture at the Courtauld Institute of Art. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's research seminar. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to just say a few words about these research seminars. This forms the first of our research seminars this year, part of a long-standing tradition of work in progress seminars on medieval subjects organized or instituted several years ago by colleagues at the Courtauld. These are opportunities for us to invite speakers from beyond the Courtauld and sometimes within to speak to us about their new research projects and to discuss them. Traditionally, they've been followed by questions, and we will do that today. In the past, when we've had the privilege, as we now understand it, of doing these things face-to-face, they were also followed by copious quantities of very bad and warm white wine. We don't have that pleasure today, but we are nonetheless really delighted to welcome Mikhail Mulbauer to give this first event in our calendar this year, and also to welcome attendees and listeners from all over the world. Before I introduce our speaker, let me just highlight two events that are coming up, organized via the Courtauld Research Forum, that may be of interest to those listening today. One is on Thursday, the 12th of November, when Jonathan Nelson will speak about Ethiopian Christians in Florence, Filippino Lippi's Adoration of the Magi and Miracle of St. Philip. And the second event is on Wednesday, the 18th of November, also in this medieval work in progress series, when John Osborne will be talking about the elephant in the room at Gourdon in Burgundy. And details of both those events can be found on the Courtauld Research Forum events page. It's my pleasure now to introduce our speaker for this evening, who will talk for about 40 minutes or so before we turn to an opportunity for questions. Mikhail Mulbauer is a specialist in the architecture of medieval Ethiopia and Egypt. He earned his BA from Queen's College, CUNY, and his PhD in art history and archaeology from Columbia University in 2020. And he currently teaches there as a core lecturer. And his dissertation was the first monographic study of cruciform plan churches in northern Ethiopia, a study informed by extensive field work from there, and that is currently being revised into a book entitled Bastions of the Cross, Medieval Rock-Cut Cruciform Churches of Tigray, Ethiopia. And this talk that he's giving us this evening, I believe, comes out of that book project. His research has been supported by numerous fellowships and grants, and he has published in the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians on an Italian Renaissance face on a new Eritrea, the 1939 restoration of the Church of Ebrehe wa Speer, forgive my pronunciation, and also has published in West 86, the Rhinoceros Horn Beakers of Menelik II of Ethiopia, Materiality, Ritual, and Kingship, and has numerous other publications in the pipeline. So we're really looking forward to this talk. Mikhail, thank you very much, and I will pass over to you.
Okay, great. And I should share my screen now. Okay, and so the entire picture, you're able to see that, Tom/Fern?
Yes, that's great, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, all right, great. So thank you so much for having me here to present. It's a nice opportunity. So thank you, Tom, for organizing this, and Fern also for your technical support. Tigray, the northernmost province of Ethiopia, became a massive repository for Rock-Hewn churches and the center of their production from the early Middle Ages to today. Most recent estimates place the number of Rock-Hewn churches at 200, most of which are located in the sandstone or limestone mesas, locally called ambas, of Eastern Tigray, and are generally of small size. The actual number is likely higher, but infrastructural problems, isolation, and cloistered community protection often preclude accurate documentation of churches. My talk today will focus on churches produced around the year 1000, more specifically cruciform churches that were hewn out of rock in East Tigray and are otherwise unparalleled in scale, form, and the use of vaulting. In my discussion of them, I will both establish a relative chronology as well as explore the radical decision-making behind their production. As the only churches of their kind, as I will show, they represent something of a grand architectural experiment and embody the excitement of northern Ethiopia's re-entry into world trade and political stability in the early Middle Ages. Indeed, such monuments could and should be seen against similar architectural movements, such as the Fatimid classical revival and the development of the Romanesque in Western Europe, which occurred at the same time and responded to similar circumstances in the Mediterranean basin. In antiquity, northern Ethiopia was the heartland of the Aksumite Empire, based around the Red Sea port of Adulis, now in Eritrea, and the West Tigrayan highland city of Aksum, from which it is named. Though little is known about it, it seems to have been a very powerful trading empire and was noted as such in the annals of its neighbors. Utilizing the highlands' access to the Red Sea, the Aksumite Empire served as a middleman for ivory from East Africa and the Trans-Sahara, salt from the Danakil Depression, as well as frankincense and myrrh from Yemen. Most importantly, it was integrated into Roman and Byzantine maritime trade with India for silk and spices. The country's elites were somewhat Christianized in the 4th century, and later in the Miaphysite doctrine, probably due to affiliations with Alexandria. Ethiopian Christianity, therefore, thereafter remained under official control of the Alexandrian Patriarchate in Egypt until 1960, albeit with varying degrees of actual ecclesiastical and cultural influence. From this shared late antique Christian origin emerges the form of the characteristic church in Ethiopia, the basilica. Ethiopian churches from the 4th century until the 15th century were longitudinally oriented multi-tiered halls terminating in a sanctuary. The churches generally followed a 3 and occasionally 5-aisled plan with rectangular east ends. In areas with frequent Mediterranean contacts, east ends were apsed. During the 6th century, Aksum reached its relative zenith before an abrupt collapse in the 7th. Though specifics are not understood, the most recent archaeological evidence points to a catastrophic dam collapse, which drowned the port city of Adulis, in addition to rampant soil degradation and deforestation from the centuries prior. Because the 6th century Justinianic plague likely entered through the Red Sea, this too probably exacerbated the aforementioned issues. Following the collapse of the late antique empire of Aksum, Ethiopia entered a so-called Dark Age period. However, around the year 1000, a post-Aksumite state commissioned a triad of centralized and cruciform churches in East Tigray, unparalleled in scale, form, and the use of barrel vaults. I locate these churches as a conscious reinvention of the aisled cruciform churches of late antiquity, using indigenous forms of articulation and also new innovations introduced from Egypt. I integrate these monuments into a broader pattern of introspection towards late antiquity. that occurred in the societies of the Mediterranean basin around the 11th century. This probably occurred because of the arrival of new ecclesiastical authorities and merchants from Egypt into the region, which in turn provided much needed political and economic stability, unseen since late antiquity. While the subjects of my study are some of the largest and best known churches in Tigray, the selection of the three, Abrehawa Tbeha, Wukro-Cherkos, and Mikael Amba, which has no relation to my name, as the subjects of my study are not random. All three churches exist within 50 kilometers one another in the highlands of East Tigray and uniquely embody the same general ground plan, that of an aisled cruciform. The construction is modular, based around a central measurement, which is then multiplied. Spatial hierarchy in the main vessel is created with the use of a monolithic ceiling cross for the crossing space and a dome for the choir, wherein barrel vaults are used to articulate the nave and transept. The churches are formal isolates. They are also probably some of the earliest in Ethiopia. The churches, as with most in the region, are severely understudied, and the total volume of secondary source material on them amounts to less than 100 pages. Despite this general lack of knowledge, as the best known churches of Tigray, they have received some academic treatment, largely since the 1960s. Indeed, attached to the main north-south artery of trade between the coast and the interior highlands, the churches are unique in that they are referenced in a number of early European travel logs. The Church of Wukro-Cherkos received its first Western visitor as early as the 16th century, Abrehawa Tbeha in the early 19th century, and Mikael Amba in 1840. The subtractive nature of the enterprise of hewn churches generally resists symmetrical dimensions. The distribution of the bays in Abrehawa Tbeha and its sister churches nevertheless creates the spatial and also liturgical effects of a centralized space. The combined large-scale cruciform and centralized plan that Abrehawa Tbeha embodies makes it architecturally unique. An aisled transept intersecting a three-aisle nave forms a centralized cross-shaped configuration. The bays are defined through engaged crossbeams and octagonal piers with stepped capitals. The crossing space is raised with an engaged bracketed monumental cross on the ceiling, which is surmounted by 4 arches and supported by cruciform compound piers. All piers are uniform in height, measuring 4 meters high from base to capital. Immediately east of the crossing space is the choir, which is crowned with a cupola. The church terminates on its east end in a semicircular apse with a synthronon, or curved bench, connected to domed pastaphoria on either side. The vaults and ceilings of the church are in a somewhat bad state of repair, but are ornamented in sculpted relief, appearing to date from when the church was first hewn. Though large in size compared to other churches in the region, the centralized space, created through the application of lateral aisles, in addition to the spatial hierarchy, gives the beholder an impression of a unified interior. Engaged pilasters on the walls, together with engaged lintels, further subdivide the interior into 18 bays. The church is oriented west to east. The north and south of the church are opened with a 3-aisled transept, which is barrel vaulted in its central bays, as is the eastern part of the nave. The central crossing space is subtly raised by 1 meter. While now carved into a flat ceiling, the eastern end of the nave preceding the crossing space includes a residual setback molding of a round arch. This would signal that there was an intent for a barrel vault over the nave, which was then changed at a later point likely within the same building campaign, due to the fine carving of the reworked nave ceiling, and is raised up 30 centimeters up. The endeavor of rock cutting as subtractive building requires a different system of planning, one that estimates adequate space for final design under spatial constraints defined by the dimensions of the unworked stone. The centralized and cruciform plan, unlike the basilica, therefore requires planning based on width in addition to length. If such a roughly centralized space was to be created through the use of 4 equal cross arms, the core had to be planned first. It is for this reason that I consider the crossing space to be the defining point in the church construction, since the placement and dimensions of this bay was the module that thereby defined the dimensions of the rest of the church. It was only after this core module was carved that masons could elaborate on the nave and transept arms. The dimensions of a Brehawat Beha's crossing, when superimposed on the crossing spaces of its sister churches, fits closely. Despite their relative variances in form, all churches follow formally from the same central measurement, that of a roughly 3 meter by 3 meter square module. Furthermore, the piers of all 3 churches stand at a uniform 4 meters in height. It is for this reason that I consider the churches as a set, as all 3 were planned according to the same core module and volumetric constraints. Indeed, it has long been thought that Wukro-Cherkos and Michael Amba are architectural copies of a Brehawat Beha on account of the latter's relative perfection. While I disagree with the largely connoissorial motives of earlier scholars, my relative chronology illustrates how the awkward placement of the centralized cruciform ground plan into the latter 2 locations was a, quote, square peg in a round hole, so to speak. In attempting to copy the plan and articulation of a Brehawat Beha, the buildings of Michael Amba encountered several problems that caused them to abandon its initial building campaign. In response to these inherent problems, I suggest that the church was left incomplete in its initial building program, and then finished in a way that was not related to the prototype's design. A Brehawat Beha, carved into the western terminus of a mountain ridge, is as much a product of its location as it is the ingenuity of its masons. Here, there was space for a church of unparalleled scale, both in terms of scale and volume. As such, it was likely planned and hewn entirely from west to east, top to bottom, the masons removing spoils as they carved into the mountain, while using the unworked stone as a temporary platform. In conceiving of the church spatially from west to east, rather than from the top down, masons maintained total control over the height and depth of the construction. With the ample room afforded by the mountainside location, spatial hierarchy could accompany the ground plan. Presumably, a test tunnel was made in order to carve out the central bay module, which measured 4 meters by 3 meters by 3 meters, which was then replicated. The lateral aisles rise to an average height of 5 meters, while the nave and transept arms have vault heights of around 6 meters. The crossing space and domed choir, for clear liturgical reasons, remain the highest points at 7 and 8 meters respectively. Structural failure was for the most part avoided by maintaining a minimum thickness of stone for the roof and plentiful interior supports. The vault heights follow the slight southern slope of the mountain escarpment and are on average 10 centimeters lower than on the south. But when was the church carved? While Brehawat Beha's liturgical furnishings point to a general conservatism, other clues may better indicate when this church was built. Generally speaking, in the absence of Ethiopian liturgical documents, it can be assumed that Tigrayan churches were built by dictate of the Coptic Egyptian liturgy. Since the church was de jure Egyptian until 1960, indeed, the Patriarch Cyril II in the late 11th century instructed Ethiopia to, quote, use the same customs as in all the churches of Egypt, end quote. As such, Ethiopian churches may be provisionally dated through their liturgical layout, which changed in the course of the Middle Ages from the use of the old ordo, that is the preparation of sacramental bread and wine on a table in the church prothesis or side chamber, before they're transferred to the main altar, to the use of multiple altars with no extra preparatory table. For the former, this required an ease of access to the altar through an eastern passageway and an enlarged side room for a preparatory table, or if the church was using the middle ordo, a bread selection table. The chambers that flank the apse in a breha watzbeha both communicate with it and seem to indicate a liturgical interaction. Because the south chamber is much larger than the north, this room's size was likely adjusted in order to accommodate this table, seemingly indicating that it was built according to this older liturgical tradition, which fell out of use gradually in Ethiopia from the mid-12th century to the present day. As such, the relative size of the side chambers and their communication with the main altar were no longer explicitly necessary for churches planned under these new liturgical guidelines. Michael Amba, located some 50 kilometers away from Abreha Watzbeha, is almost identical to the aforementioned church in plan and articulation, though its placement could not be more different. Found atop of flat-topped mesa of beige sandstone, it is only accessible via a steep climb. The Church of Michael Amba is sunk into a gently downward sloping portion of a flat plateau. In order to render this plan into the stone of the hilltop, the masons had to use a completely different system to plan the church. While it is clear that the semi-monolithic portions of the main vessel of Abreha Watzbeha were not plotted out and then hewn through downward estimation, post holes on the roof of Michael Amba indicate that this church was. Having surveyed the roof, I have found that the placement of post holes reflect the carving program undertaken underneath it, with the majority of post holes defining the cruciform mass of the detached west end. Presumably, when the church was carved, these superficial holes would provide a loose schematic with which to estimate the eventual cruciform spatial division of the church interior. It was this critical junction in the foundation of both churches which made all the difference in their relative successes. Builders at Michael Amba defined the external configuration of the church from what they could observe surveying the mesa from above. Working downwards instead of west to east, masons estimated the exterior proportions of Abreha Watzbeha, and in doing so, expanded them. The exterior cruciform shape was made too broad at over 20 meters, while the protruding west end was left too stubby, leaving room only for an anteroom sided with masses of then unworked stone. A semicircular courtyard was hewn that in turn blocked light from entering the transept windows. Responding to these constraints, the masons truncated the nave into a single bay with a length and width of 2 meters. Likewise, the north transept arm was made too long, with considerable discrepancy left between the length of the vault and the internal supports. By defining the overall depth of the church by the semicircular courtyard it inhabited, the masons did not allow room for spatial hierarchy like that exhibited in Abreha Watzbeha. Despite this, hierarchy was attempted, as a change in chisel marks in the upper walls of the western bays and narthex indicate that the west ceiling heights were originally 75 centimeters lower to contrast with the vault heights of the transept. However, even this was less pronounced, as the crossing space rises to a lower overall height than the transept vaults. The church generally appears unfinished. The north and south ends of the transept remain unhewn. The walls are undecorated and lack the low relief ornament found characteristic of its sister churches. Additionally, there is evidence that indicates that windows were not even present in the first campaign, so that the church was completely dark. However, the church is relatively light-filled today. This I ascribe to a second building campaign that is partially attested to in a primary source and in liturgical evidence. A gospel book retained in the treasury of Michael Amba includes within it a recopied note by the Alexandrian Metropolitan Michael, which states that in the year 1150, the monastery was consecrated as part of a larger campaign of church building. As such, certain scholars have ascribed the whole campaign to the 12th century on the basis of this note. Indeed, faded paintings on the northwesternmost bay depicting saints and the Majestas Domini are stylistically identical to those found in the roughly contemporary Egyptian monastery of St. Anthony on the Red Sea, the monastery with which the Metropolitan was affiliated and a regular place of pilgrimage for Ethiopians. Additionally, the matching size of the eastern altar chambers, together with a triple chancel screen, shows that indeed this church was liturgically planned with multiple altars, in line with the aforementioned 12th century liturgical changes. I return again to this gospel note. Michael Amba is noted as being consecrated, kadasa, rather than fully built, hanatsa. This linguistic distinction is conspicuous, and indeed, the consecration was probably a second building campaign, wherein Michael Amba was finished. It was at this time when the huge unworked masses flanking the narthex were roughly hewn and lighted. A change in carving program, visible in the stone, shows that the west windows were opened up on the main vessel through the recarving of the upper levels. There is also evidence that the floor was 80 centimeters higher on both the inside and outside than it is today. Together with the lack of light penetration, this would have made the church cramped in addition to dark in its hypothetical first phase. This restoration seems to have allowed Michael Amba to function as a church, which prior was riddled with conceptual problems. Michael Amba thus shows the pitfalls of architectural citation in rock-cut architecture. It could not replicate the spatial hierarchy, centralized spatial configuration, or unparalleled scale of a Breha Watts Beha in an otherwise flat-topped space. That is why it had to be finished in a later building campaign that was independent of the prototypical design. It was likely that Ethiopian masons and Egyptian painters remodeled this church on orders from the Metropolitan Michael, on a visit from the nearby Egyptian Cathedral of Mariam Nazret that was founded likewise in 1150 CE, perhaps to establish political control over churches commissioned by an earlier power or esteemed dynastic predecessors. Wukrachirkos is also a casualty of architectural citation. This church was carved into the hill west to east, like a Breha Watts Beha. Wukrachirkos, however, narrowed a Breha Watts Beha's plan in response to geological constraints of the hill from which it was carved. The transept was shortened to a stubby 10 meters, the same width as the nave. While the citation of its prototype is clear in the sculpting of lateral support piers, its crossing module, and consistent pier height, the church effectively functions as a three-aisled basilica. In the case of Wukro-Cherkos, the spatial significance of the cruciform plan was lost with its narrow shape. While successfully not modified into a narrower rock escarpment, Wukro-Cherkos' dependence on Abrahawat's Beha as the prototype also led to issues in its functioning. In steadfastly copying the window configuration of Abrahawat's Beha, light only entered through a tiny transept. Today, the inside is blackened with soot, reflecting prodigious use of torches in its interior. It is for this reason that my relative chronology among all three monuments considers Abrahawat's Beha as the prototype and Wukro-Cherkos and Mikael Amba copies of it. I believe all three were built under the same system of patronage from before the mid-12th century, as per the Gospel book note, but more specifically in the second half of the 11th century, when the liturgical guidelines of the Old or Middle Ordo were still in use, and contact with Egypt was especially close, as to be explained further in my talk. Conceived through the use of modules and centralized spatial hierarchy, and embodying a unique ground plan, Abrahawat's Beha and its sister churches remain enigmatic in terms of their formal characteristics. Why were they planned and constructed in such a radical way? Late antiquity may be a fruitful point of inquiry for the origin of these plans, as this was also a time when such aisled cruciform churches were popular as prestigious and effective pilgrimage churches. The 6th century Cathedral of Sana'a in Yemen, today only known through Arabic writings from the centuries after, was a joint production between Justinian's Byzantium and Aksumite South Arabia. The church had an extensive mosaic program, including a starry sky on its vaults, and also book-matched marble revetments on its dado, which now sheathe the interior of the Great Mosque of Damascus. This was all within, however, an Aksumite half-timbered structure. The use of galleries created a sharp pyramidal profile centered on the nave vault. This church, which Barbara Finster argues may have cited in its measurements other structures such as Abu Minas in Egypt, the Justinianic Church of the Nativity, and the Cathedral of Aksum, would have been loaded with symbolic meaning, likely retained in the cultural memory of post-Aksumite Tigrayans. Ethiopia remained in close contact with Egypt, and the architectural production of the Egyptian church is a good point of departure. Abu Mina, a T-shaped basilica dating from the 5th century, for example, is the largest and one of the most celebrated. Today, only observable from archaeological remains, it was a great pilgrimage destination near Alexandria, consisting of a massive three-aisled main vessel, replete with an aisled transept and conched apse. Medieval Ethiopians, tied ecclesiastically to the Coptic Church, held Egyptian pilgrimage sites like Abu Minas in high esteem. Furthermore, the Cathedral of Sana'a, patronized during the peak of Aksumite influence, represented Christian ecumenism on Ethiopian terms. As in Byzantium, cruciform churches with transept arms, let alone aisled transepts, were a late antique and early medieval occurrence in Egypt, disappearing under new systems of patronage and the architectural preferences of the later centuries. Because Ethiopia did not produce aisled cruciform churches in late antiquity, Abrahawat's Beha may have been created as a broad citation and reinvention of this shared late antique heritage. With Fatimid infrastructural supports for pilgrimage along both the Nile and Red Sea, it is likely that Ethiopians were able to become reacquainted with such pilgrimage sites, especially with the establishment of Ethiopian monasteries in the Egyptian Nile Delta. The singular presence of a synthronon, or curved bench, in the apse of a breha seems to hint at a deliberate archaizing, since this device fell out of use both in Byzantium and Egypt by the High Middle Ages. Furthermore, as gleaned from archaeological evidence, Ethiopia didn't seem to have used these low benches even in late antiquity. Unique spatial hierarchy accompanied the plan. While the aisles have flat ceilings, the cross arms are crowned with barrel vaults. While not of particular significance elsewhere in the Middle Ages, barrel vaults in medieval Ethiopia are only found in rock-cut constructions, the first being my subject triad, followed by several of the famous Lalibela churches in the 13th century. In the 15th century, wooden barrel vaults were used in 3 known freestanding churches. But in all these cases, vaults were created through timber beams set around transverse wooden arches, and not through centering or mortar, as in Byzantium, Egypt, and Nubia, and not part of a distinct structural system. Given that barrel vaults do not have a precedent as a structural system in Ethiopia, it may be asked what spurred on this development, especially since the mechanics behind their use seem to have been novel to the craftsmen who produced them. The answer may lie in Egypt, as the Fatimid Caliphate appeared to be heavily invested in Ethiopia between the 10th and 11th century. A late 11th century episode in the Chronicle of the Coptic Patriarchate involves the governor of Fatimid Egypt, Badr al-Jamali, forcing the Coptic Patriarchate to move to Fustat, or Old Cairo, from Alexandria. With the Patriarch under surveillance, the order was given to him that Ethiopia accept and provide safe passage to Egyptian commercial agents. Badr al-Jamali even hinged the election of an archbishop on the promise that more mosques were built for the Fatimid-aligned Muslim population of Tigray. Archaeological evidence confirms this. Currently studied by the ERC Horn East project are a number of Arabic inscribed gravestones and sculptural fragments dated to the Fatimid period from Tigray and its surrounds. This array of material and primary source information securely points to the presence of Fatimid-aligned Muslim trading colonies engaging with the Danakil salt route and textile trade. This injection of wealth from overseas trade and the new ecclesiastical authorities provided by Egypt in the Fatimid period, I think provided some stability for whatever polity was active in East Tigray. The goal of the Fatimids, through this investment in a Christian ally, may have been as a springboard for the eventual restoration of Fatimid power in Mecca and Medina, just across the straits from the Ethiopian highlands. It was in the Fatimid period that vaulting and the use of domes were used in Egypt in fortifications, mosques, and churches. As part of a well-studied 11th century classical revival, the use of centered barrel and groin vaults in Egypt was a statement against the vernacular traditions otherwise present in Egyptian architecture. Under Badr al-Jamali's viziership, the mud brick walls of Cairo were knocked down and replaced with huge 3-story masonry walls in clear citation of Romano-Byzantine fortifications. Likewise, barrel vaults came to replace saddleback roofs in Coptic churches in this period. In line with Fatimid economic and religious investments in 11th century Tigray, architectural experimentation in the form of barrel vaults may be grounded in their contemporary use in Egypt. With timber in short supply, Ethiopians seem to have turned to the rock face to undertake this architectural revolution themselves. In the context of early medieval Ethiopia, the barrel vault can be considered somewhat of an object of desire. Barrel vaulting signaled technological prowess, wealth, and even Romanness. For Ethiopians, the use of this unfamiliar structural system would have carried this significance, made all the more desirable for its contemporary Egyptian prestige. Indeed, with the overall late antique historicism employed in the design of the church, barrel vaults may have still carried the cultural memory of their use in the Justinianic churches of late antiquity, which Ethiopians took part in building in the case of Sana, and which served as pilgrimage destinations for Ethiopians in the centuries after. These vaults complemented the reinvented aisled cruciform plan of Abreha Watzbeha, in that it represented historicism, contemporaneity, and prestige all at the same time. Like the grandiose dimensions of the church, the use of vaults is also an imaginative and innovative departure from an otherwise dependence on freestanding models for rock-hewn churches. The mid-11th century was a watershed for the history of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Fatimid Caliphate, hitherto the main power in the region, seemed on the brink of collapse. A mid-11th century revival of political power came with a revival of antique architectural forms in Egypt and an obsession with the reuse of Roman building materials. The Roman past, also reflected in the Byzantine present, represented a historical citation, reinvention, and an aspiration at once. East Tigray, economically and ecclesiastically integrated with Egypt in this period, also used this newfound political stability as a moment of millennial resurgence, as part of a larger classical revival. Tigrayan cruciform churches, replete with experimental architectural features and archaic furnishings, were also a placement in time through a reinvention and reinterpretation of the late antique past. Formally recalling late antique aisled cruciform churches and accommodating innovative Fatimid vaulting, Abreha Watzbeha, Wukro Cherkos, and Mikael Amba reflect in their plan and articulation a radical departure in Ethiopian architecture for a localized end. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mikhail, for a really wonderful talk. And although we can't join together in applauding you, I'm sure that everyone in rooms, wherever they are, is applauding you. So thank you very much.